If you really like a form of media, chances are you're probably a part of that fandom, and if you're like me, throughout your lifetime you've probably been in many different fandoms, some better than others. But when it comes to me as well as many other different artists, the fandoms that we've been a part of is quite evident whenever we draw an excess amount of fan art for that said fandom. I like to call these significant fandoms in my art career my quote-unquote eras for fun. Like for example, a few Let It Deep eras. I think what people know me as are from Voltron Legendary Defender, Demon Slayer, Black Clover, and nowadays Genshin Impact. Interests shift over time, but sometimes my brain likes to go back and reminisce over the series that I used to really love. I'm not sure about other artists, but whenever my brain is done with a fandom, I don't usually draw anything from that said fandom anymore because my interests are completely occupied by a different series or media that I'm currently really into at the time. But I think I really want to go back in time and reminisce about the more energetic sides of the media that I used to partake in, or I guess what some people would call cringy, and draw some pieces from back then and see how much my art style has changed over time. Call this a dive back in time with a little bit of art analysis, so let's begin with the first fandom. Danganronpa. So I was actually really into Danganronpa back in 2014 when I first discovered the anime. I never really was into the game aspect of Danganronpa until later down the road, and I actually didn't draw a lot of digital art for it then, but a lot more traditional art since back then I was drawing with an iPad too that didn't have a lot of digital art capabilities as an iPad does nowadays, but back then I was still in my Geek Katekka Hitman Reborn obsession then, so of course I drew the protagonists of both media I enjoyed together. But for now we're just gonna crop it and focus on the Naegi aspect of the art. Now I don't think this is a bad attempt at all really. I'll give 14-year-old Light some credit here. Oh my god, it's been 10 years. I think upon first glance, I can tell that all the colors I use for Naegi are color picked from the anime references, which is not a bad thing. And if anything, color picking is great when it comes to learning more about how to use colors when doing digital art and practicing where to shade when imitating the anime art style, since these styles tend to use cell shading for easier animation, and it's a coloring style that I personally use then and now. When overseeing the look of the line art, I can tell and remember that my line art had no sensitivity settings, and I think although I didn't have the resources then, sensitivity in one's line art can make the strokes look more alive, since for those who don't know, sensitivity settings on a tablet or if you're using an iPad, your Apple Pen imitates your hand movement similarly to how you would draw on a pencil or paper. The harder you press, the darker your lines, the lighter you press, the lighter your lines. Here, for example, you can tell that the sensitivity isn't really used because the line art is consistent throughout the piece. So let's see how I would redraw this now. So whenever I free draw, I like to start with the hairline, in which are Naegi's bangs right about here. I like to make it my starting point while I expand upon it, and seeing how I'm drawing the rest of the face afterwards. If you notice my line work here, it's more thin compared to the OG line art, as well as the line weight added from the sensitivity. I'm looking over at the Naegi reference as I draw, and I'm trying to implement my own style to the line art, such as the fluffy hair, how I typically draw hoodies, as well as my eye styles. If you take a look at how I used to draw Naegi's facial structure back then, he definitely has a case of the Dorito chin syndrome. Sometimes I feel like it still lingers, but definitely how I draw faces nowadays, I tend to shape the chin structure and overall head shape a bit more round. Naegi has such a unique hairstyle, and it's definitely struck with the spiky hair protagonist trope, so I had a difficult time trying to properly replicate his Ohoge in my art style, but after a couple of attempts, I did a decent outcome, I hope. I'm just gonna be drawing a bust of him compared to the full waist in the original. Now starting off the coloring, I'm creating a gray layer underneath the line art for which I will clip all of my colorings onto. This is so my colored layers don't escape the area where I lay down my flats. When choosing the colors, I chose to eyeball them and try not to color pick to see how my personal color choices differ from the anime's reference. Trying to eyeball your colors gives you a better practice onto how to estimate your colors by eye, but also see what type of colors you feel work with your personal art style. Saying that color picked colors may not 100% reflect on your personal coloring style if you're looking for something that's not replicating the reference. Coloring all of my art, I tend to cell shade, which is a simple act of coloring, but also neat and gives off a sort of resemblance to a simple anime art style. When doing my shading and highlights, I used my favorite tool from Clip Studio, which is my lasso fill, and it helps me fill in the many different shading areas I feel are needed with my coloring. And then I didn't like how the hair was covering Naegi's eye, so I painted over the layers to adjust that and made his front strand a little bit shorter. So finishing it up, we have the two Naegi side by side. Now technically a 10-year-old difference. Now look at that. I've always wanted to draw more Danganronpa stuff, but this is definitely encouraging me to do more in the future. For our next fandom, Undertale. Undertale to me is still such a beautiful game with a wonderful soundtrack and story, and I share the same feelings with Deltarune as well. Back when Undertale was released in 2015, I was lucky enough to have one of my high school friends, shout out to Layla, invite me over to her house to experience Undertale on my own, seeing how the experience of Undertale is unique to how each player makes their own decisions. I think I had such a big period of time where everything I drew was Undertale related, but the internet never saw that because it was all traditional, similar to my Danganronpa art. One of my sketchbooks, half of it is just Undertale art. Undertale has always had such a huge place in my heart and can be shown in my most popular video on YouTube, which is Deltarune, but you know, it's an important game series to me as well. For one of the digital art pieces that I'll examine is one of the earliest digital art pieces that I have of Frisk and Kara. I think this one is definitely more drawn down the road, I think around 2017, but you can see the sensitivity is used more in the line art compared to the Naegi art. Around this time, I stopped relying on the colors on the references themselves and started eyeballing colors that seemed appeasing to my eye as an artist. I still have fluffy hair syndrome that I've left for the longest time, and it's not that bad overall, but here is how I would draw Frisk and Kara nowadays. Starting off for both characters, I realized that a lot of it is based on character headcanons compared to the pixelated versions that they have in the game, so we're gonna go off of mine. We'll start up with Frisk, and now for both Frisk and Kara's hair, seeing that they have pretty much matching bobs, I wanted to try and capture that by making their hair less fluffy than I drew it before, and I wanted to give their sweater a better structure and to make sure to better distribute the proportions of their bodies, saying it's a bit more difficult for me personally to draw kids. But Frisk is definitely a lot easier to draw, seeing that their eyes are completely closed. When coloring Frisk, I'm eyeballing the colors compared to the OG, given in dark brown hair as well as skin on the tanner side. My tablet colors and monitor colors don't match too well, so the colors are a bit lighter than I expected, but I still love it nonetheless. And looking at my old Frisk compared to the reference, I wonder if it was because of the influence of other fan art or not, but I saw that the old Frisk was wearing brown shorts, while in the reference they seem to be having blue bottoms, but I wanted to make it more accurate to the original, so I'm giving them blue shorts. And of course, ending up the black tennis shoes to protect their feet from their long journey. And with Kara, drawing them as a mirror to Frisk, my thought process was pretty much the same, except with little traits that distinguish them separate from Frisk. Like most popular headcanons, I'm drawing Kara's eyes open and red, and I'm coloring Kara's hair a little lighter brown compared to Frisk, as well as coloring their skin lighter to reflect and distinguish their rosy cheeks. I'm making sure to draw Kara to scale to match with Frisk, so when I put the two together, they're a matching pair. Now look at the difference, very slight, but pretty evident, and I absolutely loved how the both of them turned out. And for the last fandom of this video, it's gonna be, of course, Voltron Legendary Defender. Now, for my early days of YouTube and how a lot of people knew me from Instagram, Voltron Legendary Defender was one of my highlights, one of my golden eras. Although there's so much that went wrong with both the series as well as the fandom, I always have Voltron to thank for being one of the fandoms to start my growth on the internet as an artist. And you know what? I've actually been seeing a resurgence of the fandom on TikTok for a little bit, and seeing all those TikToks, I'm just like, you know what if I'm just a little silly and I go back into the fandom? But I know I can never look back at the chaos that has consumed everyone's brains and then left us with the void and emptiness that series finale left us. And two of my most favorite characters that I love drawing for obvious reasons was Keith and Lance, two main characters who will be the hot topic if you ever talk to the vast majority of the people who are in the fandom. Oh, my Roman Empire. I drew these two a lot, so here is a collage on how I drew each of these characters to demonstrate how different the art styles have changed over the years for me personally. First off with Lance, here's what it looked like when I drew him earlier when I first got into Voltron, and here was pretty much the last time that I drew Lance. And here is the collage featuring our King Keith, and here is the oldest version of Keith that I can find versus the most recent. So this piece in particular, however, seems to be one of my first digital Clans arts, so we're gonna use that as a reference for the redraw. It's a very silly piece. I think this was drawn at a similar time to the Frisk and Kara art. It's a simple bust shot with the two capturing a bit of their personalities for my Tumblr header, so it's not gonna be exact when we redraw it, but we're gonna start off with Keith for this one, since Keith was my absolute favorite of the two. Right off the bat, again, I think nowadays my liner is a lot thinner compared to my old art, and it's seen with how I draw my strokes when drawing Keith. I consider Keith a lot easier to draw, seeing that he has bangs to work with, and any characters with bangs can be seen with my last characters who drew in this video are my favorite to draw. And honestly, I believe that Voltron was the reason why I started making my hair a lot more fluffy, since the OG art style had a lot of curves and waves when drawing their hair and volume. I think drawing these two for me personally was really funny because I drew these two so much back when I was in my peak Voltron era, so it was kind of like muscle memory drawing the character designs. So for Lance, I'm drawing him in the same way, starting off with his hairline. It's a little tricky in this case because compared to Keith, I'm drawing his hairline to shape his head versus covering the majority of his head. I think comparing the original Lance reference and the way I'm drawing Lance now, I'm implementing a lot of personal style, like the amount of hair that he has, and of course the fluffiness factor. Compared to Keith, Lance has a lot smaller pupils, so I'm trying to showcase that here when I'm drawing his eyes as well. I'm going to be basing these two off of earlier seasons, so Lance will be taller here. Combining the two line arts, I'm going to be making them the same base just to make things easier for me. Following my usual drawing process, I'm laying down the flats for each character before I proceed to the cell shading. Looking at my color choices between the original and the one I'm drawing at the moment, I think nowadays it looks like my personal preference in color choices has been more towards the saturated and muted side, which is interesting to note. I think drawing Clans after so long was such a refresher, and I think it's really fun to look back and see how differently I'm choosing to draw the characters then compared to now. Whenever I look back at comparisons from then and now, sometimes I get a bit discouraged, not gonna lie, when there isn't too much of a grand difference when it comes to my personal digital art style. After all, I've been pretty much using the same techniques over the years, but it's also probably because I don't really have a personal desire to purposely change my art style at all. I guess I always found some something that worked for me and went with it. And although the differences aren't drastic, they're still present, and I love looking back at old art, whether it's traditional or digital, because everything I've drawn, whether it's a digital print or sketch on a loose leaf paper, it's all a part of my journey and creative process as an artist and as a person. And I can't wait to see the small differences that my art style will have in the next years to come. So thank you all for joining me for this blast into the past, and I'll see you all very soon. Until next time.